Hi, it is Writing Wednesday, and this is Janet Fitch. And I'm going to take today to answer reader questions. Um, People write to me, and you can write to me, and you can ask questions right here. And happy to take on your writing questions today. So let's get started. Um, I have a question from Lauren Sarazin. I'm wondering what your thoughts are with including some experimental techniques in an overall plotted narrative. For instance, is it too disruptive to include segments of first-person present in a third-person past narrative? Maybe that's too specific or weird, but in general, any advice on experimenting without plaguing your reader? Um, when you're introducing an experimental or unexpected element in what is otherwise a conventional narrative. It's important to set up an agreement or an awareness inside the reader that this is what you're going to be doing. I wouldn't do it like right in the middle of the book. Unless you're going to really interject kind of a good chunk of it, so it actually becomes like another part two. I think that if you're going to introduce experimental techniques in what has, hey Linda, hey Sayward, very well. If you're going to introduce experimental techniques into a book that has been written otherwise in a very conventional manner, you might go back and see where you can kind of pry it open early on, and more distinctly, weave your techniques together. So the reader doesn't come up against just this pothole. It's like, wow, where did that come from? Because so much of fiction is setting up an agreement with the reader of the kind of book this is going to be. So you want to show them fairly early on that you're going to be having a conventional narrative that will then move back and forth from first present to third past, or have other elements breaking into the narrative. I would set that up pretty early, rather than just, and if you're going to do it, do it. So you don't want them to stumble into a first person paragraph or something like 200 pages in. It's like, where did that come from? Hey, Ruthie. So so it's always a rhythmic thing, I think. If you're going to push form, let the reader know that this is going to be happening fairly early on, and if you're going to do it, do it. Don't just occasionally decide, oh, I'd rather do this in first. You just want it to feel intentional, and that the writer has control of their material, and that it's going to add something. It's not just the writer playing, although there's nothing wrong with the writer playing, but definitely you want the reader to feel that you're doing it intentionally and you're in control of your material. So put it in the blender. Make sure that it's part of the fabric of the piece. So I'm taking reader questions today, writer questions. So if you have questions while I'm going along, just throw them out there, and I'll see if I can answer. Here's another question from Rani Azada, and her question is about endings. How do you manage to have your main characters gain some kind of inner resolution in a way that isn't all perfectly happy, yet not deeply resigned in some depressing way? I have issues wrapping up character-driven stories where life beats down a main character in several ways, and it's sort of up to them to lift themselves up in a lasting way for the story. Okay, well, I think endings are hard. Endings are always hard. And you can kill a perfectly decent story or book with a bad ending. Alas, this is a fact, and we all struggle with that. Um, I think a story versus a novel. First of all, you have to. They have different demands of an ending. You know, a short story can be the curtain opening and the curtain closing, and how where you choose to close the curtain on a short story is often enough. You know, the resolution where the character gets it. It's like in a short story, the character doesn't have to get it, the reader has to get it. So very often short story endings seem a little ephemeral to a reader of novels because it sets up a feeling in the reader, and that's what the ending is supposed to do, is leave you with that feeling. So I'd say don't worry about resolution or what the character recognizes in a short story. Think about what is the mood of the ending of the story. Did something change in the way the reader is thinking about the story, in the way the reader perceives the characters, in the way the reader feels about maybe an issue that they came in with one point of view or no point of view, and they're left with something, a new understanding of something. A novel is different, I think, because a character-driven novel is all about the change in the character. So that an ending where they gain some kind of inner resolution in a way that isn't perfectly happy yet not deeply resigned, meaning not, you know, in complete despair. And there are certainly novels like that. Some of our darkest writers will leave you like that. But obviously you don't want to do that. So, and it's sort of up to them to lift themselves up in a lasting way for the story. Now, in my work, I tend to feel that a character who has fought their way nobly through adversity, that's heroic. You know, that just sometimes getting out of bed and doing it again is heroic. And the novel is the arena that shows us, you know, sometimes just the heroism of survival. So I believe, you know, in a triumph, not with the audience rising up and applauding. I hate movies that end with group hugs and applause, and as if a person needs that for a resolution. I think it's more a recognition that, you know, I've survived it, I've changed in a way that has allowed me to emerge, you know, beaten and bloody, but I have survived this experience. To me, that's a happy ending. So I'm, you know, as far as, you know, getting something that's too resolved, there's no reason to push that too far. You don't have to wrap it up in a bow. You know, your reader is very intelligent and has been with you the whole way. And for a character to have some element that moves back through the book and comments on that, just to realize, you know, say, Paint It Black, you know, the punk rock book of the suicide. The character realizes that, you know, just to have lived and touched other people, that you have made a mark on reality, and that the despair of suicide is that you forget that your being here made a difference. So sometimes it's a very small moment of recognition, just a little statement or some symbolic action to show that the reader, the character is embodying some kind of a resolution, to lift anchor if you've been stuck, and suddenly, the character can lift anchor, and that's a release. So I'm releasing what it was that kept me anchored to the problem. It's a good idea to look at books that you've admired and really, open up their endings and analyze, how do the themes come together here? What is it that makes me feel satisfied that the story is done? So that is a question. And I've got a couple more, but I've got some questions here. So let's do these first. This is Christy. When writing about fiction, some of the events are linked to real-world events and are woven into the story, into the character's backstory. Are there any additional guidelines in the line of fiction and real events that can be considered to ensure respect to the events that happen, but allow for the fictional element, the aspect of the character to evolve? If you're doing historical, you can't fudge what happened. You can make up an event that didn't happen and use it as an historic event. Say a protest, you're writing about the 60s and your character goes to a protest at X and X and X and X and such time, and there was no protest in that place at that time. You can do that. But if you go to, say, the Century City March, which had was at a certain time in a certain place, and it unfolded in a certain way, you can't fudge that. Don't put that in a different month or something. It has to happen the way it happened. So I feel like the fiction aspect of the character is where you pick where they were involved, how they were involved or not involved. You can have a fictional incident that did not happen that you can then have your character participate in, but don't fudge what actually happened. So here's one from Linda. Is Ernest Hemingway still relevant in the Me Too era, seeing how he was such a drunk and a misogynist? I think every reader has to decide these questions for themselves. I think that sometimes someone has something to offer that is so valuable that you hold your nose and you read it and then you cringe when you get to the parts that make you ill and just say, this really is making me sick. But this is incredible, and I need to read this, and I need to understand how he or she is doing what they're doing, but recognizing your own reactions to what you see that you don't like, and then let that be part of the experience of reading it. So, I think that some of the things that a writer like Hemingway or, many other extremely flawed people do is so interesting that it's worth it's worth the nausea at knowing, what they were like. I read Pound, and, he was found guilty of treason and put in an insane asylum to save his life because he was freaking crazy and he couldn't keep his mouth shut, because he thought that people understood him. And that's true in life, as like people don't always understand you or sympathize, or, sometimes you're completely blind to the larger issues. And, he's a problematic figure, but would I recommend people not reading Pound because he was, you know, he was a hideous anti-Semite and fascist. But he didn't really understand he was dealing with things in the abstract, and he was not picturing what was happening in the physical reality. But he's a really interesting poet, and you could learn from his structure. And I think that anything we can learn from, you just have to know, oh, yeah, don't forget who this guy was. And when you find yourself cringe, you don't have to swallow it wholesale either. You hold it in there, and you take what you need and what's interesting, what's good about it. But all the time you're going to be aware of who that person is, and it will color the experience. There's no doubt about it. And this is Sayward. Hi. Speaking of character-driven novels, do you think plotting methods such as Save the Cat and Story Grid can be applied to character-driven and conflict-driven stories? This is interesting. I have a difficult time applying these to my own work. I have never heard of Save the Cat or Story Grid plotting methods. I'm not good at plotting. I write to discover. And when I plot, I feel like I've already discovered. And so I don't want to write the book once I've done it. I feel like I've done it. So I do it for the discovery. Save the Cat and Story Grid, though, I will look those up. I don't even know what that is. How to plot a story? Fill in the blanks. That's interesting. I'm gonna Google that and see what that is. There's so many apps and stuff, and it's just I can't say don't use these things. It's called what is it? Story Grid. Sometimes these things are just formatting, where you can come to, you get some kind of a visual format that you put this. I don't know if it would do what it would do for, story grids. Well, anyway, I think I'll dig into that and see what that is. I mean, obviously, I don't use any kind of a formula for writing. It just doesn't apply. The essence of surprise and turning corners and going into odd places, and it seems, the anathema to have some kind of a formula. I can understand the screenplay or something that's really structurally demanding, but I'll have to look into it. I don't use anything. I use Scrivener to handle my research, and I have done early drafts on it. I'm not good at it. April Davila, if you look her up, she has sort of little mini tutorials for writers about Scrivener, which I'm sure are wonderful. It's a very flexible tool. Mainly for the research, you can toggle back and forth from your story to your research. I write in Word, whatever comes Word, but I use Scrivener to hold my research. Super useful. But I'll look into the others. Okay, so this is Zunaid. Sorry for mispronunciations. Many years ago, I was fortunate to read Whitney Otto's How to Make an American Quilt. In it, she approaches the novel by offering us with pre-chapter passages that contain that end up having a thematic connection to the chapter once you read it. Do you know what this technique is called? or if such a technique is advisable, common, or useful. No, I think she invented it. Inventing form is one of the great pleasures of writing. And this speaks back to the earlier question about experimental techniques, is that she's invented a technique that does something that gives the reader an extra layer of pleasure rather than just telling the story straight on, by giving you a little preface to each chapter that becomes like a mystery. And then when you find what that means, it's like, oh. And I think in general, titles, chapter title, I love chapter titles because it does the same thing. It's like, the killer known, or daffodils ahoy. It sets up a little mystery, and then you read the chapter, and it's like, oh, it's a theme there. Oh, look at that, or there are the daffodils. Okay, gives a little extra pleasure, and you can't give the reader too much pleasure in a book. There's no such thing. So do I think such a technique is advisable, common, and useful? Well, you got pleasure from it, so it is useful. Is it advisable? It's so personal to the writer, how you want your book to be read, and where you want to tweak the reader, and I don't think it's that common. But you could when could one use this approach? It's more of a 19th century thing, wherein the hero, and then there's the chapter. That's kind of Dickensian, I think. I think it could be used in a very humorous way. Getting that tone into your head, as like even long titles can be like that, long chapter titles. I think it'd be humorous. I also think it can be a way to heighten the theme. I wonder if she wrote them afterwards, or wrote them during, or wrote them before she wrote the chapter. That'd be interesting to know. I think that it could set a period and a period voice in a really interesting way. I think that there are writers who have used long quotes from other writers in the same way. Like, I think Olga Tarkazuk's Flights has big preface quotes in each chapter, as I recall. I think so. And something else I read recently had quotes from a mystery by Robert Galbraith. J.K. Rowling used quotes from English thinkers called the Silkworm, and then another one did lines from Blue Oyster Cult, which is, be careful because using rock lyrics is very expensive. All right, let's see what else we have here. Anybody write something else? All right, I've got some more of these questions. Let's dig them out. I know one of it. Let's see. I've run out of power on my computer. Of course, I had one person did have a question about. He wanted to write about sci-fi, about aliens, but he didn't want it to be sci-fi or considered sci-fi, or have aliens in a work. Can you have aliens in a work without it being science fiction? I think that by saying something like that, you're shorting what the genre science fiction is at the moment. I think that very serious literary works are being produced in that genre. Olivia Butler's The Wild Seed, Parable of the Sower, Doris Lessing. My God, I haven't read all those um, future alternative reality. Alternative reality, would you call that sci-fi? Um, I know that there's a lot of aliens. Um, if we are looking at other creatures, would you call Mrs. Caliban or a movie like um, The Shape of Water, was that what it was called? Where they are alien creatures or magical creatures, mystical, you know, uh, non-standard creatures, but it's more um, in the realm of speculative fiction or imaginative, or even in the case of The Shape of Water or something like that, you'd call that like fantasy rather than science fiction. Depends on your alien and how they're constructed and what your intentions are, what the mood of the piece is. There's a wonderful section of a Michael Cunningham book called Specimen Days that has 3 parts, and he tries to do 3 different genres. So he does I'm trying to remember the order of them, but one was, as I recall, like horror, one was, or thriller, one was Western, and one was futuristic. And the futuristic part of Specimen Days was the best part. And it's the same sort of 3 characters in all 3 pieces of it. But the third one, they are all like, you know, um, un they're non-human beings who are wonderfully portrayed, and that would be called literary fiction because of the ambition of it and the fact that there are 3 different ones. So he's commenting on a genre rather than writing in the genre. So that's interesting. So yeah, I think that you can write about aliens without it being narrowly cast as science fiction. But I also think that there's such wonderful things being done in science fiction that you might not want to run from the being called that. There we go, now I got it. Yeah, so that was from Lawson Shepard. So you can write about aliens without making the work seem sci-fi by being maybe not as thrilling, being more psychological, more slowing things down and really living through them, thinking more politically, like Octavia Butler. So there are, yes, I think one can do that. Here's another one. How do you think authors can effectively create morally gray characters? I think that the morally gray character is really interesting. Um, it is, it's basically saying that that people are not universally, you know, kind, altruistic, bright all the time. That we have our dark side. Sometimes it comes out in the worst possible way. Sometimes we have choices where there is no right choice. What a friend calls the hot soup problem. Once you've taken a mouthful of hot soup, there is no right answer after that. So the moral, I don't think of characters necessarily as morally gray. because I don't think anybody is purely dark or light. I think we're all, we all have all of the tones that we can go into. It's more the situation that human beings are put in, and then what they do, and then how they feel about what they've done. And sometimes people who do something bad, who feel bad about it, but they kind of follow up with more of the same, because it's like one bad thing leads to another bad thing and they can't seem to get out of that. That would be a morally gray character. Somebody who comes into the book with with a dark streak would be your obvious candidate for this. So here's a so Save the Cat, Ruthie is saying, is a screenplay formula. Yeah. Any kind of app and fill in the blank and plotting thing usually is a screenplay thing, because they don't have the time to wander around and open the closets and wander down, side streets and get mugged and lie in the alley for a while. They have to march along. So there's more formula involved. Novels, there's no formula. And short stories are way no formula. So all us pansters are driven towards plotting by the masses. Pansters. What are pansters, Sayward? It's maddening. I once did a short story video on the hierarchy of truth in literature or writing. I thought it was fascinating, would suggest an expansion of the topic here on Facebook, given recent events on the subject of cultural appropriation. A few years ago, writer Lionel Shriver did a keynote in Australia about the subject and opened a can of worms. I'd love to know your feelings and thoughts. That's huge. This is a huge one. Hierarchy of truth in literature. That's worth looking at. I would like to see that. Yeah, it is a huge question, and people are still wrestling. It's just going to go. It's just going to be an ongoing conversation. People you can have your ideas about this, and then you read something and it goes, wow, So I'd say keep your mind open. Always, as always, always, if you are writing, the further you're writing from your own experience, the more rigorous that research has to be. But it's also a cultural moment that we're examining all of this stuff, and it's a time to read and keep an open mind and really see what people of various experiences are writing and thinking about. Let's see what we have. Save the Cat is a fascinating read, even if you're not a plotter. Yeah, I always, it's a publication prescribed for screenwriting. Yeah, I always open to things, but sometimes anything that's a formula kind of in the end doesn't do it for me, because there is no easy way. You have to really be in touch with yourself. But if it helps to think of 12 moments that are going to be kind of your fence posts, and you can move from post to post across the raging river, if that helps you get your novel kind of pinned, why not? I mean, I say that when when people are doing NaNoWriMo, the 1 month, writing a novel in a month. Nobody can write a novel in a month. I don't think people can write a novel in a year. I'm kind of like the 4, 5, 6, 7 year writer. But you can get some moments that you want to have in your book. And maybe these kind of programs or methods are useful to do that. Save the Cat writes a novel. McKee's story. I studied with him at USC in film school. Hold these things very lightly. Don't, if you're writing fiction and you're reading something intended for screenplay, don't be aware of them, read them, but keep them in RAM memory, which is the short-term thing on your computer. Don't necessarily write it to the hard drive, because they're not really applicable to fiction, and you'll short yourself if you try to replicate that in a work of fiction. Yeah, I love Scrivener. Okay, Shona says, I don't plot, but I often get stuck in the weeds. Oh, see, this is... Hello? Am I still there? Did I screw this up somehow? Hello? Oh, I somehow switched this around. Hi. Low tech. Shona says, I don't plot, but I often get stuck in the weeds or wander around and lose focus. Okay, now we're talking. What do you do when you wander around in the weeds? This is why not plotting is a problem, because you do get stuck in blind alleys and you're in the weeds and you don't know where you are. It's the end of African Queen and you've got that boat in the reeds. You don't know where you are. Yeah. Okay, so what I do when I am in this situation is first being very careful to write in scenes. So nobody leaves a scene in the same emotion that they came into it. Something happens in the scene. The character cannot go back to the way it was before. That saved my life. When I first learned that, it's like, oh. So then at least you're going somewhere when you get in, when you get through a scene where the character can't return. Something has happened. There's a progression to your plot. Another thing that that's the main thing. So what I do, sometimes in Scrivener they have little index cards, or sometimes they'll just write in a notebook. It's like, what is going on here? What is happening here? What do I want out of this scene? Write in scenes, because a lot of the wandering around the weeds is when you're not writing in scenes. There's not real time, real space, and something happens where the character can't go back to the way before. That's going to help you a lot. And sometimes you try stuff out. It's still unformed as you're working on it. Sometimes you're going to try something out. What if I do a scene from this character's point of view, and you try it and it doesn't really make it any better, Take it out. So don't beat yourself up if you try something, it doesn't work. It's much better to admit to yourself that something isn't working than to try to make something work that it's not working. And having a writer's group is really helpful, so that every week or every 2 weeks, this or this. You can really, when you're working on your own, you can really get stuck in the weeds. So anyway, I hope the scene thing might save you. Say, sometimes you write something, you don't know what it is, you're just writing it, and then you have to ask yourself, what the heck was that about? And then you can shape it into a scene. You don't necessarily do that the first time around, but when you feel like you're lost, that's what you do. You go back and you go, when character X finds themselves in situation Y, okay, so here's my character, and then the situation Y puts pressure on your character. How am I putting pressure on my character here? Have I put the same pressure on them in the same way in another scene, so then I don't need that scene? Or I have to change that scene. And do they come in with one emotion, come out with another emotion? Has something happened where they can't return to the way it was before? The sci-fi question might it be called speculative fiction? Yes. Um, Movies are always formulaic. Not always. The problem is that there's so much money involved in making movies that everybody is terrified of something truly original. So we all need to support truly original work that isn't formulaic. Let somebody else go to those films. I go to those films. Oh, come on. But seek out the ones that aren't and support them as well. So flash fiction. Every year, a group of 100 students or so study flash fiction theory here at a creative school in South Africa, and we study one of your flash stories. Let's see more. Interpretations and readings are always insightful and novel each year. Mr. Twister. Oh, they used one of my flash stories. Ah, Mr. Twister. How cool! How cool is that? Oh, well, I have to look at that again and try to remember which one that was. Because I read a lot of flash fiction because I write long fiction. So it's really hard for me to put in that big labor on a story. But I can't, when I'm working on a long fiction, I don't write stories when I'm writing something big because I'm putting 100% into the big thing. So it's fun to write short stories, shorts, flash fiction. And that's a fun thing to do if you're writing a long novel. Thank you. Oh, how cool is that? Is the general public able to access the short story that became the springboard for Paint It Black? There is the last issue of Black Clock was something called Remnants. Black Clock 18, I think it was. Remnants. And I was able to put in a story, the original story of Paint It Black. It was from Michael's point. Actually, it was from 3 points of view. And this was Michael's point of view. And the story is called A Shrine for Unbelievers. That was going to be the title of the novel, which ended up as Paint It Black. And so Black Clock 13. And I thank you. Maybe I'll do an anthology of my. I don't write a lot of short stories, but there's a possibility of someday getting an anthology. On my website, there's a list of other material that I've published, and if it's available online, there'll be a way to click through. Let's see, writing in scenes. There are other older Writing Wednesdays about writing in scene. A scene is one time, one place. It's called the Aristotelian unities of time and place. A scene takes place at one time and one place. If you leave that place, it's another scene. So if you have your character coming into a room, meeting somebody else, having some kind of a thing going on, something has to happen that the character cannot, your protagonist cannot go back to the way it was before. And then you can leave the scene. So stay in the scene until something happens, and that will really help. All righty. So here's another question. Okay, we got morally gray. This is just a motivational question, and every writer has this. What do I do when I have no motivation to write? Well, there's several schools of thought about that. One of which is a poet, Wanda Coleman. Gotta read her. She is amazing. Wanda Coleman. Mercurochrome. Oh my God. An LA poet. Unfortunately, died a couple of years ago. But she always said, sometimes the muse is sleeping and you just have to wait until she wakes up. Um, Now, I'm not like that. I am somebody who just, I don't get inspiration unless I'm working. So I have to ask myself, um, why aren't you working? What are you afraid of? Why aren't you working? Why are you avoiding it? And it's always fear. It's fear it's going to be lousy. It's fear that you don't know where you're going. It's fear that it won't be as wonderful as what you imagine. And that is the curse of the writer. I have a business card that says on the back, it's a quote from Thomas Mann: "A writer is someone for whom writing is more difficult than for other people. And we suffer over it more." And, what should I do when I have no motivation to write? One camp says, then don't write. But that's obviously not what you wanted to hear. What you wanted to hear is, I want to write, but I'm having a hard time sitting down. I'm having a hard time engaging. Sometimes reading something, one of those books that made you want to write in the first place, then you get that, oh, I've got to go do this. There's a way of they call annotations. We've talked about this on Writing Wednesdays. When you read a book, to write your response to the book, not like a book report, like not what happens in the book, but how it's affecting you as a writer. And if you're not reading books that affect you as a writer, these books that make you want to throw down the book and go write, look for that book that gives you the inspiration. And if you are lacking motivation, sometimes reading them, it's like, oh yeah, now I remember why I'm doing this. So that's a really good one. All right, so let's see if there's anything else I can answer for you or answer to you. Hope you're going to have a good week and a good writing week. I'm getting ideas for, I've started writing this new book and get, ideas. I always feel this dissatisfaction when I don't have the answer to a problem that I'm having, or I haven't quite nailed it. I haven't quite figured out like who's going to be speaking, who's going to get a voice in this book. And, very beginning, it's very exciting, but it's like not quite sure. I do work with a writer's group because they can often, it's like having more heads than just yours. If they know you and they like what you do, they get what you do. Somebody said something on Sunday in my writer's group, and it's like, wow, okay, now that, I needed to hear that. I was having problems with a character's very internal point of view, somebody having mental problems. And somebody who has had a lot of contact with people with that particular problem said, what, you're not pushing it far enough. You're not going far enough. And it's like, oh yeah, thank you. So I've got to say, keep an eye out for, if you don't have a writer's group, keep an eye out for people who of similar worldview as you, literary worldview. Find people who like the books you like, and so they get you, you get them. You can speak a common language, and we'll see you next week. And if you have more questions, and put them in the comments, and I'll pick them off for next week. Okay, thanks. Bye.